Good afternoon. I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. And that gentleman sitting on the couch, Ed Nersessian, is the other co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Welcome to Neuroeconomics, the secret life of Homo economicus. And the Homo economicus, the definition is being tested by both existential and subcortical factors today because of the fact of the absence of two of the previously announced members of the panel. David Kirkpatrick, Fortune editor, is on the coast and for obvious reasons has not been able to make it. That is to say, there are no planes until 12 o'clock tomorrow night. So filling in for David will be Ed Nersessian as moderator, who's the co-director, as I said before. Further information about all our programs is available at www.philoctetes.org. And I'm also very pleased to announce that this particular panel is the first of our worldwide simulcasts of all Philoctetes panels. So this is being simulcast right now on the web, which makes me kind of like the Ed Sullivan of neuroscience. And now I'm very pleased to present Ed Nersessian. Ed Nersessian, as I said before, is co-director of the Philoctetes Center, and he's also the founding editor of the Journal of Neuroanalysis. So Ed will moderate the panel this afternoon, and introduce the other panelists.
Thank you. I can't fill David Kirkpatrick's shoes because they're both literally and symbolically much too big for me. But I'll try my best and see what I can do. So I'll start with introducing the panelists. Elizabeth Phelps is a professor of psychology and neural science at New York University. She is currently the president of the Society for Neuroeconomics and serves on the boards of the Association for Psychological Science and the Society of Neuroethics. Most of her work has been focused on learning, memory, and emotion. Paul Glimcher is Associate Professor of Neural Science and Psychology at New York University Center for Neuroscience. He's an investigator for the National Eye Institute and founding president of the Society for Neuroeconomics. Bill Brown has long been in the economic forecasting business, formerly as chief economist at J.P. Morgan, and currently as an economic advisor to Barclays Capital and an independent macroeconomic trader. Alberto Bisin is Associate Professor of Economics at New York University. He is an Associate Editor of Research in Economics and Economic Theory and has written numerous articles for economics journals. I think the best way to start today is by asking Elizabeth Phelps, who is the current president of the Society of Neuroeconomics, to tell us what neuroeconomics is.
Oh, I'm going to defer to the founding president of Neuroeconomics because I think Paul has been instrumental in pushing this field forward, and I'm sort of riding on his coattails a little bit.
I'm going to defer to Danny, who's not here. No. So I'll tell you my personal answer, and I think it's not everyone's answer. I was trained as a neurophysiologist. I learned how to study the activity of single nerve cells in humans and animals making decisions. I learned how to use brain scanners on people and animals. And what I was interested in was decision making, how you pick a wife, how you pick an ice cream flavor. And that seemed to be a reasonable thing for a neurobiologist to study, but it became clear that first off, neurobiologists were ill-equipped, theoretically, to think about that problem. They really were engineers who built wiring diagrams and did not think deeply about mental life, psychological processes, or predictions of optimality theory. And this led me first to psychology, to think about mental life and mental experience, and I realized over the course of many years, and became eventually a professor in that department as well, that you had to combine the insights of psychology, the experimental insights of how people actually behave, if you were with neuroscientific methods, if you were going to develop any comprehensive description of human behavior. Now that's not too surprising. As I learned more and became driven to sort of understand everyone who had thought about decision making, it became clear to me that there actually was at NYU, there's actually a department of decision making, and that department was called the Economics Department. And that drove me over many years to try and synthesize into my own view the economic approach, which is really, I think, finally about specifying what people ought to do. Psychology is sort of empirically what they do, and neuroscience is, how does the hardware achieve what they do? And can it explain the gaps between what they should do and what they do? So for me, neuroeconomics is the synthesis of at least these three disciplines. And its goal really is to adjudicate the gap between economic theory, which tells us so clearly now what an efficient chooser, an efficient person would do, and psychological observation, which tells us people don't do that. And there's a hole there because economics is this spectacular theoretical device that works very well in large groups and works, with apologies, quite poorly with regard to large chunks of individual behavior. Psychology is a good descriptive tool, but it really at this moment lacks any coherent sweeping theoretical view. So you get this problem. Psychologists can tell us what's wrong with economic theory, economists can tell us what people ought to do, but you don't have a theory of what people do. And it's my hope that neuroscience will fill that gap and that these three disciplines together will create an algorithmic or mechanistic model of human behavior which will be able to unite all three levels. And I think that the grand unifying excitement of that, the reason there's so much excitement around neuroeconomics today, at least in my mind, is because that would be a synthesis very different from the one that occurred between molecular biology and biology in the 50s, or between physics and chemistry at the turn of the 1900s. It would actually be a fusion across the border of the social and natural sciences. It would suggest that the kinds of grand unities we see throughout the natural sciences will progress ultimately to the social sciences as well.
Want to say something? Add something?
I mean, if we're going to sort of go through how we got to this, I'll give my little story to start,
okay.
And then talk about how I became involved in neuroeconomics. So I was interested in understanding human behavior broadly. So I trained initially in psychology and cognition, but then realized looking at the brain was going to be a very powerful way to help us understand cognition. And I retrained in neuroscience. So for the past several years, I've been specializing in how emotion changes how we learn and remember. And of course, one of the consequences of learning that something's emotional is that we're going to make different choices. And so I got to this field because I became interested in how what I'm studying about emotion and learning relates to the choices we make. I mean, we assume, of course, when we find out something's fearful or rewarding or something like that, we're going to make a different choice. And when I got into looking at choices, much like Paul found, the psychology of decision making has merged quite a bit with economics, and that got me into thinking about economics and collaborating with economists. So I came at this more from just the psychological perspective of understanding how it is when we learn things, emotion changes them, and how that changes the choices that we make. And in doing this, I'm just starting to really learn about economics and collaborating with economists and understanding this perspective. And it's given me sort of the theoretical and computational aspects of economics is now adding something to my psychological neuroscience work that wasn't there previously. So I see the merging of the two enhancing both fields. And so the Society for Neuroeconomics, which Paul was instrumental in starting, I went to the second meeting. The first one was invitation only. I didn't get invited. And I went to the second meeting, and at that one it was decided to form a society, which came about, and there's been about 4 meetings so far of the society. And one of the things they've been trying to do is alternate the presidents to be both a neuroscientist or psychologist and an economist. So Paul was the first president, the second was Colin Kammerer, who's an economist, and I'm the third, bringing a little bit more of the psychological aspects of the field.
Can I add, it was not I who did not invite her.
It was not Paul. It had nothing to do with Paul. And I think, one of the interesting things for me as somebody who's gone between fields within the study of behavior, neuroscience, and psychology, and within psychology, different subdisciplines, so emotion spans social psychology, clinical psychology, and cognitive psychology, is going to be how the culture of these two fields merge. So it's psychology and neuroscience has become a rather broad tent because we study all of human behavior. The field of economics, now that I'm learning about it, doesn't seem to be such a broad tent. And I think it's going to be more of a challenge for the neuroscience and psychological research. I mean, psychology has been doing this for quite a while, but for the neuroscience research to influence how the economists are thinking, I think there's already been quite an influence from economics and how neuroscientists are thinking these days.
Now, we have two non-neuroeconomics people, so what's your reaction to what is going on in terms of neuroeconomics and all the excitement about it?
Me, yes. Thanks. Yes, so let's do the same. So I come from economics, and economics is the way I was taught, and most economists still nowadays are taught, is rational choice. So that's what we do. This is the basic assumption, and then there's a lot of analysis of what this implies for all sorts of behavior. Economists don't think of themselves as just thinking about economics. I myself have done a lot of work which many would think of as sociology, maybe. So that's the basic idea. Now, this has been criticized by sociologists and anthropologists in general, by social sciences for a long time. And by this I mean rational choice. And the reaction of economists is usually being, well, whatever, we don't care. And that's because the criticism was, to our understanding, in part because economists are arrogant, but also because, I mean, that criticism, from our point of view, came from, was nested in not really understanding what an economic model is. Now then the psychologists started criticizing, and that sounded much more interesting to us. Many of us, including myself, thought there was a lot of very interesting ideas there, and there's been from the 70s on an enormous amount of research, usually experiments in the lab, which has shown that in many very consistent, coherent ways, people were not playing rational choice, were not acting as rational actors the way we would think they did. That still doesn't mean the rational choice model is wrong, but it makes you think that maybe there's something interesting to do. So that's my reaction. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. I would say I completely disagree with Paul when he says economics is about what people ought to do. We think of it as a positive theory, not as a normative theory, including rational choice. So, of course, the whole point here is that economists are interested in behavior and think about rational choice behavior, are interested in behavior not per se, but for the implication that behavior has on economic or social choices and equilibrium. So the fact that you see people not really quite acting as rational actors in the lab, if our rational choice models of financial markets work well, we think that's good. It means that the deviation from rational choice, in some sense, get corrected by the large numbers, by the market, however you want to think about, and they're good enough. So my reaction to this is, I think rational choice has been incredibly successful in many fields, and I think the evidence in the lab and the evidence that is coming now, much more recently from the other lab, I mean in the brain, it's incredibly interesting in giving us possibly some in some sense, some new general view about how people act. So I think I actually instead completely agree with Paul when he says, in psychology, we just don't have a basic model that we can apply. And that's why I think rational choice has been that successful, because it's first incredibly simple, second incredibly deep, much deeper than just the words mean, and very unifying. And then, yes, it's in some sense wrong, and we are looking for something else, which of the same order, though, methodologically, with something else which looks like rational choice in the sense of a very simple, or a few very simple basic principles, and where that we can push from that. And so in some sense, if I look at this literature, I'm very excited because it looks like we're going there. We're not there, obviously, but we are going there. I must say also personally, when I got into this, I started reading psychology. And I was very disappointed. I mean, I think we're very different. We have a very different, we economists and psychologists have a very different way of thinking in terms of what's a model, what's a theory. When I started reading neurosciences, I mean, not real neuroscience because I don't understand, but I mean, the part of neuroscience, Paul's book, or the part of neuroscience which is closer to economists, to me that seemed very exciting because we were speaking a relatively similar language. I mean, we agree on what is a model, we agree on what explaining means, we agree on many things, on many levels, and that seems very fruitful, I think.
Can I correct you about something?
Can I just ask him to say 2 words about what is rational choice?
Yes. So, rational choice, the way economists think about this is they set a set of rules that we call them axioms, a set of rules that an agent, which we call rational, should satisfy when he chooses. Okay, so these are things of the sort. If in this big table there are suppose these are glasses of different liquids, and if in this there's a Coke and a beer and something else, and if in this table I take the Coke, there's a beer here and there's orange juice over there, and so if I take Coke, fine, it must mean somehow that I like Coke. Now let's go on a different table. There still is Coke, there still is orange juice over there, but you took away beer. Well, if because beer is not there, I choose orange juice, then this is not rational. Okay, so this is a very simple kind of argument, and from there, what a lot of theory, a lot of, let's say, logical reasoning from this, and of course other stuff of this sort, but from this a lot of logical reasoning is come up with is, it tells you that an agent which satisfies in his choice this kind of behavior will end up maximizing some utility function. And that's where most of economists start from. So this background is called decision theory. People have looked at, in some sense, people have looked at what does really rationality means, and in a nutshell it really means this, what I just said about the glasses. What it implies is the maximization of some utility function. So most of economics doesn't do the glasses, most of economics is about, writes down a utility function and thinks that an agent maximizes, chooses an element of some set, which makes this utility function of the agent as high as possible. That's what rational choice is.
Thank you. Can I get Bill to say something and then come?
Well, I come from a little bit of a different background in the sense I do no research or investigation. I'm a practical economist, having been in that business a long time. But in recent years, when I've read some of this literature, it seems very natural to me, because one of the things I did at J.P. Morgan was participate in a risk management effort. Was basically how to control traders to make them make fewer mistakes, do a better job. And in that process, it was very clear that humans are not good at doing certain things. And it's the exact same things I read in the papers on neuroeconomics. They don't deal well with probability distributions, particularly the tails and small probabilities. They're very associative. They associate one thing with another for reasons that aren't rational, you can say. They're very scenario-oriented. They like to think in terms of a pattern that plays out that is like the real world. They can't separate themselves from that. And all of these things are not very helpful in terms of pricing a derivative security, say, or positioning in the market. You need to be rational if you want to make money in that business. So back in the 70s, we used to try to use ways to train people to be better. For example, we'd ask them to give us probability distributions. This is our best traders. And we would collect them, and we would talk about them, make people think about them, and show them the historical ones. And then we'd come back 6 months later and say, look, you've given me this probability distribution on where the 10-year bond yield's going to be, and 55% of the time, the result is in a box over here that you put 0 probability of happening. There's something wrong here. You're just not quite right. And we thought this would make them do a better job. And I would say all of this effort in the 70s was hopeless. You'd tell them that 6 months later, they'd come back and do the same thing. And this was the best traders. These guys weren't awful at this. They're actually doing a pretty good job out there. And it really goes to show you what the research says, is that people are hardwired to work in certain ways, and they do certain things well, and they do not do other things well, and it's very difficult to get them to do it. Now, since then, the financial world has moved in ways of just take these decisions out of individuals' intuitive grasp. You've got big computer models, algorithms, which are driving things, and an investment bank would never let some individual in the seat of his pants say, I think that's what that derivative security ought to be worth. It's just not how it's done. You haven't made the people better. You've taken the control away from the people, or you've structured it in a way that you've protected yourself from their shortcomings, at least to a large degree. That's how you got these things working better. Not improving the people, but putting up a separate system or structure to do it in. So I sort of come from a world that uses some of these things and experiences them.
Can I kvetch for a moment at Alberto? So let me put it this way. I was raised as a biologist, and the theory of natural selection is, if anything, the centerpiece of all biological thought. The theory of natural selection says that there are two animals trying to live in the same niche. The one who maximizes his reproductive fitness better wins. Okay, that is actually economics, and where the utility function is replaced by this defined notion of fitness in successive generation, number of your genes that repeat. That is to say, if there were two animals, one of which was a better utility function maximizer, more rational with regard to his fitness than the other, the animal who's the better maximizer wins. And so we would expect to find, after 600 million years of evolution on this planet, that animals ought to be pretty close to good at everything they have to do to survive. And that we believe that the rational choice model would be good predictors of their behavior. Now, in fact, that's true. Every time that this has been taken to the field with animals, it just works perfectly, and the animal's behavior is bang on. When we're talking about individual animals, like there are beautiful studies of birds trying to decide whether or not to grab a mealworm based on the size of the mealworm, how long it takes to uncover the mealworm from its shell before you eat it. You can adjust the weight of the mealworm, and the birds know exactly where the cutoff is. If the mealworm gets one iota too small, the bird knows to turn it down, because the bird is perfectly optimizing its use of time and its gathering of energy. To me, this stands in stark contrast to the way we understand the decisions of individual humans. I make a very clear distinction here between microeconomics, the study of individual human decision makers, and macroeconomics, which is kind of what Alberto is leaning on as being so good, and I agree with that. We don't understand the decision of individual human decision makers using economic models anything as well as we understand these birds. You ask people to make simple decisions about losses and gains, and they are petrified about losing money. If I say to someone, here's a lottery ticket, it carries a 50% chance of losing $100. How much do I have to pay you to buy that lottery ticket from you, or something like that? And they overvalue that lottery ticket. It's like they're so petrified of the loss, they'll pay anything to get rid of it, which makes no sense if what they're trying to do is maximize how much money they have in their pockets. Okay, so there is, I think, Alberto's got to admit, there's a huge gap in the explanation of individual human behavior at the economic level. Now, this washes out at the market level. That is to say, the rational choice models do great at the market level because you put a couple of billion agents together, and you put a couple of giant investment houses that are using trading algorithms and accounting for 20% of the market in any given instant. And now the markets look really good, and rational choice theory predicts really well. So what I see in economics is a really important gap between the quality of prediction in microeconomics and the quality of prediction in macroeconomics. The good news for economists is it doesn't matter. The bad news for us as as scholars trying to understand human behavior is the first theory doesn't work nearly as well as the second. So that's my fetch.
Should I answer?
Why not?
Answer, react. Yeah, I think I agree with most of what Paul said. I mean, I have a different view about it, but so we agree that macroeconomics is perfect. So macroeconomics works perfectly well.
Only for the moment.
Yes, only for the moment. No, but there's one point that I want to stress here. It's not macroeconomics or finance or labor economics. The way economists think of it does not come out of the large number of agents only. It relies crucially on rational choice. So it's not that any model with a million agents or many models with a million agents would work. All the prediction that economists think about in finance, the economists think about in macro, the economists think about in labor, are predictions which crucially depend on rational choice. Now, this is not like I was, but most economists are not born this way. I mean, this came out of a big fighting in the 50s and the 60s in economics, in macroeconomics, between rational choice people and non-rational choice people. Actually, might at some point go back on this. I think the reaction that most economists have to behavior, the negative reaction that most economists have to behavior against behavioral economics and neuroeconomics comes from here, because not neuroeconomics, but a lot of behavioral economics somehow throws away, how do you say in English? I don't know. Throws away the baby with the bathwater. In the sense that a lot of the stuff that economists have understood in the 60s, which are also go under the heading of rational choice, but they're not really about rational choice. They're about what we call rational expectation. They're about how we believe the world behave. I mean, we believe agents think the world behave. So that part is crucial and it's been thrown away with behavioral economics, and that's something that economists react very badly about. Okay, so the first point I'm trying to make is, it's not just the million agents. Rational choice theory tends to work reasonably well, and reasonably well in economics as such. Now, it's true that when you try and measure individual behavior, Paul is exactly right. So when we look into the lab, we see people not doing what we'd expect them to do. Okay, we as rational choice people expect them to do. It's true. There is no discussion. And that's what I said at the beginning. That's where people like me and many other people got interested in psychology and in neuroeconomics, because there's something really systematic. The fear of losses or the way people discount the future. There are many dimensions in which it's clear there's something going on. And the fact that we don't see that too much in macro or in finance is important, but we will not know, in a sense, until we have the right models which deal with this issue at the micro level. We'll have to take this model to the macro level and see if they improve, right? So in the 60s, when when economists were thinking about models without rational expectation, this is the big fight, Chicago versus MIT, whatever. So at that point, macroeconomists there were very happy with their macro models, and then these people from Chicago came and said, you shouldn't be happy, your models are wrong. So now we are happy, and maybe we're wrong being happy. So it's useful.
If you're happy, you're wrong, but that's okay.
So it's useful to go and look into this. So that's the point I wanted to make. I mean, I think in some sense, I think there's also a difference in objective here. So economists are interested in decision theory as a tool, in decisions as a tool. Paul and Liz, neuroeconomists, I think, are more interested in decision theory per se, which is fine. I mean, and how people make decisions. That's very important. For economists, economists, this is the basic assumption. We're very interested, but there are some details of that we don't care about. I mean, we call them details. They might be very important issues. So the point I think is to try and understand if we can develop a model which can substitute rational choice and which encompasses, which takes care of all these things that we see in the lab, which seem to point to people having all sorts of other dimensions which are non-rational or near rational.
So the question, if I understand it, is why do we need to understand neuroscientifically why people make the wrong choice? Why not recognize they make the wrong choice and account for it in
I think this gets to an issue. Why do you need to understand neuroscience to understand any behavior, right?
Well, no,
I mean,
because neuroscience is different from neuroeconomics.
No, I understand that, but
why not leave neuroscience to neuroscientists?
No, I understand, but I'm trying to make the point of, what can neuroscience bring to our understanding of behavior and economic behavior in particular, right? So I think, we can have psychological models about how things work, but when we look to see how they're instantiated in the brain, we may find subtleties that will then help us understand, our psychological and economic models. So this has been a debate not just in neuroeconomics, but in cognitive neuroscience and social neuroscience, and any field where you are interested in some aspect of human behavior and trying to see what you can gain from understanding brain function. So we know that understanding brain function gives us a model, another model of how behaviors are organized and put together. It's where behavior comes from. And by understanding things at this level, we're going to get a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the behavior itself. And I think that's true of economic behaviors and other behaviors. And
yeah, I agree completely. In the 1950s, the way we pharmacologically treated mental illness was we took drugs, we took ground up plants basically, separated them into subcomponents and fed them to people who were psychotic to see if they got better. One could say, that works. You have enough people, you feed them enough plants, sooner or later you'll find stuff that'll help. Now, we don't do that anymore. Now what we do is we try and understand the neural basis of psychoses. We try and understand whether there's a transmitter defect, where it lives, what reuptake device doesn't work properly. We try and develop pharmacologic strategies that are direct pointed interventions. And I'm going to bet that we have made more progress at this iterated level where you do some psychology, you do some neuroscience, you do some molecular biology, you go back and forth, you build links between the levels, that's a more productive way to treat mental illness than just grinding up plants and feeding them to people who are psychotic. Although I admit both work. So that's my answer to Alberto. There are lots of big puzzles in economics that are unresolved. As Alberto knows, one of my favorites is that people are more impulsive than they should be. They seem to value immediate gains too highly. And this leads to all kinds of macro-scale problems. People undersave for retirement. I mean, think about this problem. People don't save enough for retirement. How do we solve that in this country?
That's not the fact, by the way.
Yeah.
That's not a fact.
Let's
very far from being a fact. That's an implication of those models, as you know, and that's one possible interpretation of things that happen.
Okay, let me say it a different way then. Our government, fearing based on these observations that people do not save enough for retirement, pays people to save for retirement. That's how we solve this problem. We incentivize. In order to make sure that you won't starve to death when you are old,
the government does it because otherwise they would have to feed people who are starving to death. And people know that the government would have to feed people who are starving to death. They won't save for retirement. So, rational expectation, there you go.
I mean, just on this point of how you can have an irrational people producing a rational economy, irrational, and there's reasons for this, and it's the big numbers. It's a feedback system, like in evolution, that if you don't do it right, you lose, and there's a clear feedback through money, and there's arbitrage. There's all kinds of reasons why an economic system, particularly a finance system, can produce a rational result with irrational people underlying it. And I think economists shouldn't be criticized too much for for those rational assumptions on there. But there's a lot of other areas of behavior where these conditions don't hold, and there isn't any arbitrage. There aren't large numbers. Take designing a system for cars that would make them safer. Warning systems, lane thing, all kinds of things that it's very critical how the mind works and how humans behave. And it's very useful to know these things when you're thinking about what system in a car would improve it. Or the big problem in medical care of how the error rate. Flying an airplane, you'd never accept the error rate you're getting in hospitals now. Why is that? How do you reduce it? Well, you've got to structure the way people do that. People behave wrongly. Doctors underestimate low probability events. They don't wash their hands unless you absolutely force them to do, because it's a very low probability that'll hurt, but thousands of doctors not washing hands thousands of times, it gets big. So I think there's all kinds of areas outside of sort of finance or traditional economics where knowledge of how the human mind works can be very useful in designing solutions.
I think I hear you two guys speaking of washing of hands. Like Pontius Pilate saying, we only really care about the markets. Economics doesn't reach down to individual choice. That may be crazy, but that's not our business. And I want to push you on that.
Can I try and answer the question that you asked, Paul, which is why neuroeconomics is useful? Okay, why shouldn't neuroscientists do their own job and we do our? I don't want to come across as the guy who says they shouldn't. Paul knows I'm on the other camp. So let's take some of the example that Paul had, right? So people fear losses. People might be too impulsive. All right, so what's been the typical way of dealing with this from an economist, and I want to claim in part also psychologist? So as I said, we have utility function. We have people who say they maximize utility function. In most of the things that Paul said, he implied that what's inside the utility function, what we care about, is money or consumption. But economists have been very good at expanding this stuff, right? So they would say, oh, it's not just we care about money. We also care negatively in the sense that we don't care about losses. There you go. The puzzle is solved. Of course, it's not solved. It's
that's totally unfair, right? Alberto. Because in order for that to be true, there would have to be an existing axiom set for reference to preferences.
No, but I'm getting there. I'm exactly saying this. I'm saying people have done that. Economists have done that. Psychologists have done that, and it's crazy. So they've said, oh, it's not that people only care about consumption, about money. They also care about not losing it. Or they said, oh, it's not really that they're impulsive or anything. There's something in their utility function which makes them like, in a weird way, the present more than the future. Things of this sort, right? So these are patches. So you can go along with patches. So if we believed, and as I already said, I don't, but some people believe that people underconsume, we can write down a model where we have that sort of a patch. People care too much about the present, okay? Then it patches because the model will predict that people underconsume, undersave in some sense. That's not an explanation. I think this is why neuroscience, neuroeconomics is important. All these little patches, I mean, you can do it once, you can do it twice, you can do it 3 times. At the end, you've got nothing.
Are you saying that the explanation, let's say you now said that the reason people don't save enough is because in their temporal lobe there is an area that works in such a way as to not make them realize that it's important to save. Let's say you discover that, right. Then what do you do?
No, what I want is I want a unifying model of most of these little things because I believe there's something underneath. So let me. So there's a unifying, hopefully a unifying model. I don't care about anyone specifically. So people I know, Paul dislikes this, and I don't have a particular attachment to this, but there are out there all these 2 brains models. Huh? So this is a unifying mechanism. I mean, it can be the right one or the wrong one, but it's a unifying mechanism which will try to explain both the losses, both the fear of losses, and the present bias, and all this kind. So what I'm looking for, I'll finish. What I'm looking for in neuroeconomics as an economist is really this. It's really some underlying model of what goes wrong with my rationality model at the individual level. Once I have that, then I can try and feed it to the macro model and see if I was wrong before. That's the...
So I just want to give you an example to sort of follow up, saying why would it matter, say we know this part of the temporal lobe?
Right, and why is it better that it be neuroeconomics as opposed to behavioral economics for what he wants to do?
Okay, so we should get back to the two brain, or the two people, whatever, the two people inside your head debate at some point.
Okay.
But for instance, we did a study where we had people learn through trial and error to trust somebody or not trust somebody. So somebody's going to reward you, they're not going to reward you if you trust them in an economic exchange. And prior to them doing this, we then gave them a little vignette. This person is basically a good guy, nothing to do with economic behavior, but kind of helps his friends out, that kind of thing. Works for Teach for America. This guy's kind of sleazy. This guy's kind of average. What we see when we do this is when you're working with the good guy, you don't use the part of your brain that seems to be responding to trial and error feedback that you're getting through these economic transactions. Okay, you use another learning and memory system. That's one learning and memory system. Use another learning and memory system when the guy is good to help you guide your choices. And your choices don't change as much with a good guy, even though they're all rewarding you to the same degree. Okay, so you can say, well, maybe we would have seen that in behavior, and we did. Okay, but we know something about how those brain systems work and what kind of information they encode and what kind of information they use when they're when they're driving behavior versus another memory system's driving behavior. This now tells us something about the psychology that we wouldn't have known otherwise. We can take everything we know about those brain systems now and use that to understand why it is when it's a good guy, it doesn't bother you so much that he cheats you. And that's going to now go and inform our psychological model of how this could work. So that's just an example of how it is seeing something in the brain might then change your psychological model, because we're bringing everything we know about the brain science to that psychological model in that case. And ultimately, we care about what people do. We care about that level of description, right? But knowing this other level of description adds information to this level of description.
Well, I think the findings in neuroscience that are of the kind that Elise just mentioned are extremely important. And I think the whatever new findings are coming out of neuroscience are fascinating and exciting. But I also know that there is a kind of overexcitement about neuroscience these days, and so much so that I myself was involved some 15, 20 years ago starting neuropsychoanalysis, thinking that neuroscience was going to enlighten us and tell us a lot about psychoanalysis. And I remember very well that I, in my excitement, decided to write a paper about how neuroscience and their theory of emotions was going to help psychoanalysts with their understanding of affect theory, and presented the paper in New Orleans. And I was feeling, as I was presenting it, that I'm really talking a lot about nonsense, because I am confusing my hopes and my wishes about what this can give us with what is actually giving us. I read Colin Camerer's paper, which I have here, and I had this very intense reaction that it was exactly the way I was feeling. This is the paper, Neuroeconomics, Using Neuroscience to Make Economic Predictions, is that he seems to be trying very hard to convince you that neuroscience is going to do great things for us, but I still don't know what it's doing and how it's going to do it.
So I wish Colin were here today. I have to say that, speaking for myself, but I suspect Liz and Alberto feel the same way, we have exactly that sense reading that particular paper.
Oh, good. Reassuring.
He was the second president?
He was the second. Colin is a terrific guy. Don't get us wrong. He's a major figure in economics today. He's really serious. He's learned a tremendous amount of neuroscience. He has a lab. He does scanning experiments. Colin is even more optimistic than the two of us, and he has made promises about the future, which I'm always cautious about. Liz and I have an expression between us that a lot of people use, which is when we pick up the journal Neuron or the journal Neuroscience, and there's a colorful brain on the cover. And it's like it's got to be true. It's so beautiful. And you read the paper, and it's like they took some guy and they read him a disgusting story while he was in the brain scanner, and then they made him watch a clip from The Sound of Music, and then they took the difference in brain activation between those two, and this is the neural structure responsible for being disgusted.
Julie Andrews, I don't know.
For Julie Andrews, right? They do The Sound of Music with and without Julie Andrews, and then they find the Julie Andrews Center. And so Liz will say to me, "Did you see that paper on Julie Andrews on the cover of Neuron?" And I'll say, "You mean the Spots on Brains paper?" And so there is this tendency right now to produce these beautiful spots on brains maps. And for reasons that are a mystery, I know to the two of us, that Time Magazine, Newsweek, they love these guys. You know, all you have to do is produce a colorful brain. And first off, it's got to be true. I find economists particularly credulous in this regard, if you will. Excuse me, Alberto.
Never done it, so you can do it.
You get up, David Leibson gets up with the spots on brain picture and says, this economic theory is proven. And you're at the American Economic Association meeting. There are 500 people out there who, you know, eat partial derivatives for breakfast. But you show them a colorful brain, and they're like, "Oh, so that pretty much settles it." Like, do you even?
No. So I think there's two things. One is, I agree with all Paul has said, but there's two things. So there's one dimension which is, I believe economics is incredibly difficult and dry, and people, and it's become like that very recently. Part of it's really this rational expectation stuff, which makes it really hard, mathematically very hard. So people, though, are not used to think of economists as, we are not, but as physicists. People realize that when they talk to by people, people, journalists, people in the state who don't do this as a profession, when they talk to a physicist, they don't understand. They think, that makes sense. They don't understand. Physicists is hard. When they do it with an economist, they say, this guy must be saying a lot of things to confuse me. It's got to be simpler than that. So I think Leibson, these people, just feed it, they know this, and just feed it to the public and the journalists. Now you finally understand they were actually cheating on you. They said economics was hard. Instead, it's very easy, let me tell you. Okay, I don't think the economists actually. I don't think the economists, you were saying, buy that much those spots on the brain. I remember early on when you and Aldo Rustichini, a friend of us, many people came to give talks in economics. The people in economic department about neuroscience, after a while, the people, the standard economist would just say, I'm not going to come. They're just going to show me some brain pictures. They're very cute and nice. The brain moves and colors all up, and it's beautiful. And then they show me monkeys, and that's it. And I don't want to see that. Okay. So I think economists actually react too badly to this. There's a lot of interesting stuff that they don't say because they say, look at the brain which moves. For some reason, by the way, they are very good at this picture of the brain which moves and the flows and stuff. We're not good at doing.
You don't do graphics very well.
Yeah, we don't do graphics very well. So,
Well, certainly the economists that we like and trust, and I think are not easily taken by this stuff. And there is the quality of the debate has improved in the last 3 years, just
Absolutely.
Beyond words. Yeah. The first meeting of the Society for Neuroeconomics was a series of presentations by noted economists and neurobiologists. Of the 20 talks, maybe 4 had data to present. And the remaining 16 were basically this paper that you're talking about, like, if I could measure this, it would completely revolutionize this, and here's how I'm going to measure it.
Well, one of the things in the paper is that if you give somebody oxytocin, they become more trustful. So what are you going to do? If you want to cheat them, you give them oxytocin and then have them trust you and take their money? So it seems like the finding doesn't lead you into a place where you have a solution to the issue. So oxytocin, yes, increases bonding of the mother and the child, increases trust. It does a lot of nice things. And a lot of opioids do a lot of nice things, as we were recently finding out. But how does that help us in terms of determining affecting the person's economic behavior, which is what neuroeconomics hopefully will one day do, no?
I don't know, that's not my goal.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a goal, but
There's actually an answer to that. They've shown, economic studies have shown that societies, cultures where the trust level is high do much better in terms of everybody else's welfare.
Yep.
No, but what are you going to do? Give
I don't think
everybody.
that's his question.
No, you're not going to. What are you going to do? Give them the hormone?
No,
Give a society hormones?
That's a question for culture, but you know the biological effect
Yes.
of cultural change you make.
Right, but economics has to do more with culture than the biology of an individual.
Well, at that particular question, yeah.
I just wanted to make a couple points about your point about the persuasion of neuroscience, and particularly what Paul mentioned. Everyone seems to love these spots on brains, and this is not just happening in economics. It's happening in law, in social psychology, and all sorts of other areas where now everyone sees a brain picture and they think somehow they've solved it. And I was part of a panel once at the AAAS, and it was called the Cognitive Paparazzi, and it was just about this phenomenon. And one of the psychologists who spoke was a man named Frank Kyle, who's a professor at Yale, who's a developmental psychologist. But he's done this beautiful research showing that if you show people a picture, they overinterpret their understanding of the phenomenon. And it doesn't matter if you're describing helicopters and it's a picture of how the propellers are connected, or if it's a picture of a spot on a brain saying, this is the Julie Andrews area. It doesn't matter, right? But there is this, if you ask people specific questions, about what they actually know, then they realize they don't actually understand it. And they're pretty good. If they only got a verbal description, then their ability to estimate what they know is much better. So I think this has something to do with why all of a sudden people feel like, they all of a sudden have some understanding when there's this beautiful picture, and why it's influenced fields more than perhaps the data at this point would merit. But of course the other issue is we all know that really, this is where our behavior comes from. I think people give some sort of primacy to this level of description as opposed to other levels of description. So I think both of those phenomena come into play, and I think we have to be very careful about saying what are we actually learning from this. So, and I think the jury is still out, as it is in people talk about even with psychology, with cognitive neuroscience. The study of cognition has, looked at the brain for a very long time, and the first 5 or 10 years, you could easily argue we didn't learn a whole lot about the study of cognition from studying the brain. Certainly, since then, I think almost everyone would disagree with you. And so I think this field's very, very young, and I think we'll start to see where this is going to benefit economics, and perhaps in ways that I don't think we can predict right now. Certainly psychiatry, we can't argue this hasn't had a huge influence on things like psychiatry and other fields, and I think that's going to be true for economics in ways that may be hard for us to answer today.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this question of what's the goal? I'm a scholar of human behavior. I want to understand how people behave and why they make the choices they do and how they work at many different levels. I'm actually, this is where you can tell I'm not really an economist when I'm hanging out with the economists. I don't actually care about making the markets more efficient. I don't actually care about improving the way people save, or really even knowing whether they save enough, obviously. So I do share your skepticism. The oxytocin result's really striking. To me, what it means is a behavior as complicated as trust can be reduced to a single hormone, at least to some degree. That's an amazing neuroscientific finding. And by understanding where all the oxytocin receptors are, we can leverage that to even understand a little bit more about the neural basis of trust.
Very important.
Let me just finish for one more second. And so all of those are good. And if I can show you that those brain areas are active during some other kind of exchange, I can relate that new behavior to this underlying neural circuit, and that allows me to improve my model of that behavior as well. Does this mean we should make everybody carry nasal inhalers and use them every hour? I don't know. You have to ask a welfare economist that question, and I'm definitely not a welfare economist.
People are restless to ask questions. Let me just do one other thing, and then we go to the audience. As you may or may not know, I had a lot of communications back and forth with Professor Kahneman, who decided not to come. And one of the reasons why he at least said he didn't want to come is because he thought one of his friends would be criticized and that he didn't know enough about the work of the friend to be a good person to defend that friend. The friend is Jonathan Cohn from Princeton, and as you know, Kahneman is at Princeton. What is it about the work of Jonathan Cohn that the two of you were going to attack so harshly?
Well, no. So since he's not here, let's just jump all over Jonathan. Right.
Turn off the web feed, and we'll answer that question. No, just kidding.
Why don't you
No,
start?
but I mean, scientifically, what is your criticism? What is it you dispute or disagree with Jonathan's?
Make him explain it. It has its roots in economics.
Okay, so
We'll all chip in after you're done.
I don't. Yeah, but I don't. Okay, so of course I don't know enough. Jonathan Cohn is a neuroscientist. I don't know enough about his work. Let me say what I think it's interesting about his work, what I don't like about his work, and give an idea of what it is about. So, from the economics point of view, he'll take issue with the data. So, the idea here, as I said, as economists, I think we are looking for a unifying model of choice, which is close enough to rational choice, because we think rational choice works fine, but also able to explain a bunch of things that we see which do not agree with rational choice. So one possible unifying model is this two brains thing. So and again, I'm talking about this as an abstract model, not about anything which is happening really in the brain, because I don't know anything about what's happening in the brain. So as a general abstract model, this is a model where there are two parts of choice. One is more impulsive, and the second is more controlled, cognitive, however you want to call it. Okay, so there are many examples that you can feed into this. Okay, so the typical example that economists have in mind is people who get run over by a car when they go to England. Okay, so they look at the wrong side of the street, and it's not that they really want to be run over by the car, they just make a mistake. So what's the mistake? Then you can rationalize this by saying, oh, you know, there's some part of the brain which is somewhat automatic, which makes them do something. Look to one side of the street, and, you know, if you point to their attention that this is London, you should look at the other side, they'll do it, but you have to point it to their attention, because otherwise they don't do it. Okay, so Jonathan Cohn had looked at a bunch of, early on I think, at a bunch of models of behavior of this kind. Okay, so I think one of the things that he had in mind, they'll know much better than I do, the only thing they had in mind is this typical psychological experiment which is called Stroop, where you feed people words like the word red written in blue ink, and then people are automatically read the word, but if you ask them to name the ink color, they'll name the ink color, but something else goes on in the brain. Okay, so he has a model and a theory about whatever goes on in the brain. So some people in economics have tried to think about this general abstract model, Stroop, and the way you look when you cross the street in London, as models trying to understand this interaction between impulsive or automatic and more controlled behavior. So you can think of something like that when you think about choice over time, this issue of present bias. You can think there's the automatic part of your brain, whatever that is, that makes you grab something very quickly because that's what you're used to do, but then there's something else which says, you know, hold on. And the interaction between these two works some way, and, you know, and you have a theory of, you can think of that, some people have used this to think about tails in distribution. People don't really automatically assume that there's nothing in the tail, but then when you make them think, they'll say, yes, there's something in the tail. So this seems like a reasonable, possible general model of behavior. Okay, so Jonathan Cohn has done some of his work in psychology, and then some people in economics, David Leibson, which we mentioned before, have thought of this as explaining in his particular case was choice over time. So they have some experiments published in Science, I guess, right? They have some experiments where they look at differential activity in the brain in choices where people in choice environments where people either have a present immediate choice and environment where they don't, and they try and look at differential activation. They see something which lights up when you have the initial, when you have the immediate reward, and things which don't light up in the other case, and they say, oh, those, they call them beta areas, and that magnificently fits with the model. So this second part, as you can see, I don't think it makes any sense. There is no model to fit, and so. But to me, so I mean, right. So I think of that paper a lot along the lines of the paper that you're mentioning with Colin. It just claims way too much. But from my point of view, this vague model of the two brains, it's an interesting model. It's an interesting way to go. I think the debate which had to do with Kahneman has that, Paul and Liz will go on this, they actually do not believe there's anything like this two component in the brain, and so they're, in some sense they're even more against that paper. But
okay, let's see. This is so for me. This is an awkward place to lay out this story. I mean, amongst all of you, because what I see this as is something that's very closely related to traditional Freudian theory. The notion of two different processes inside your mind or skull, presumably the same thing, which compete with each other for control of your behavior, it's an ancient idea, of course. We could like go to the Greeks, or of course this would be a good place to go to the Greeks also, through Freud. In the 1950s and 60s, as many of you know, there was a sort of grand battle in neurobiology over whether there would be a very simple mapping between a chunk of the brain at the time called the limbic system and the Freudian notion of the id, and a chunk of the brain known as the neocortex, and Freudian notions of both the ego and the superego. And that debate sort of ended it, basically, and the decision was that that simple mapping was wrong, because you could actually remove most pieces of the limbic system and show no effect on very emotional, automatic, impulsive behaviors. And so it seemed very hard to believe that the structure that was supposed to be responsible for the id could be removed and the id-like behaviors would remain. Okay, so these ideas, I think, are an important part of our culture, and they have surfaced in economics recently in the form of two processes. So how do you explain the fact that a person who is a drug user will tell you when he's sitting in a room like this that he doesn't want to use drugs? And he'll act in a way, if you say, well, I can set it up so tomorrow you'll have drugs. He says, I don't want them, I'm trying to stay off them. So you say, okay, well, his preference is not to take drugs. Then you take him off to his pusher's house, and he looks at the door of the pusher's house, and you say, but you don't want any drugs, right? He says, no, I want drugs, please give me drugs, please give me drugs. So you can't reconcile that because he seems to have switched his preferences, right? Well, so here's the solution. There are actually two people in his head. One of those guys is in control when he's sitting in this room, and that guy doesn't want to take drugs. And there's a second person in his head. That person wants to take drugs, and something about standing in front of his pusher's house gives that second person control over the behavior of the individual. I have no problem with that as an explanatory framework. There has been a rush to use neurobiological evidence to validate those claims. Mm-hmm. And in a number of economic models, people have said, look, the two competing models are those that involve multiple agents, multiple selves, multiple actors hidden inside your head, and those which do not. So what we will do is design a scanning experiment that will take a month or two to run, and that experiment will yield neurobiological evidence of the following type under conditions where agent 1 is active, where the impulsive guy is in control. I'll scan you. When the non-impulsive guy is in control, I'll scan you. I'll take the difference in brain activation patterns between the two, and if there's any difference at all, that proves there are two people in your head. Now, as a conscious neuroscientist, that is not a clever experiment, and it doesn't prove anything. The experiments that would actually validate those hypotheses are very complicated. Liz and I have both worked on experiments like that. They take years and years to complete, and the very first of them are all now being published. They're about 3 years behind the leading edge papers on these same questions, and they actually are all coming down the opposite way from the first-time papers. They're not showing clear evidence of two systems, one switching on, the other switching off. Now, that is not to say that there are not many things that contribute to our preferences and decisions. It's not to say our preferences are always stable. It's just to say it's not going to be as easy as the limbic brain. Now, I don't even know what that means anymore, but I read that word all the time in Time magazine.
We're trying to ban it.
Liz and I are actively trying to ban it. We do not allow our graduate students.
On board with this. He wants to ban that word.
So we don't allow our graduate students to use that word anymore.
Yep.
They can name any brain structures they want, but we don't know what the limbic system is, so they can't use that word.
Just to say, I should say that unless there's a misunderstanding, in psychoanalysis, you wouldn't say there are two brains. And leaving the drug addict aside, because then he could sit in front of you and lie 100 times and then go out and take his drug. So that's a whole other problem. But a lot of people who don't have drug addiction can have totally competing ideas. Some guy breaks up with his girlfriend and he thinks this is the best thing. He wanted to break up with her for 2 years, and every time he broke up, she came and said, "Oh, I want to have the relationship again." So the moment she dates somebody else, he's running after her. Now he knows he didn't want to be with her and he was breaking up with her, but now that she's dating somebody else, so psychoanalysis says, well, let me understand why this behavior, because the psychoanalytic conviction is that there's an understandable connection between what on the surface may appear as opposing types of behavior. So just to clarify the psychoanalytic position.
But I mean, in On the Ego and the Id, Freud tells a story that sounds much more like, when you read it through the first time, it really seems like there are two agents. No. And I think that's the view.
Freud is trying to do the same thing as an anatomist does with the brain. Says there's the frontal lobe, there's this, there's that. But he at no point says, and if you look at the diagram in that paper, he has them completely connected and interconnected. And in fact, the superego he connects to the id. So it's complicated, and you can't look at it in that kind of...
but as you know, there's been a long history in neuroscience of trying to do that. And I just think this is the most recent example of that.
All I wanted to add to this was, I think the work Danny's done, which he unfortunately isn't here to talk about today, really started to go away from the rational choice model and come up with another way that people make choices. And it's been a very useful heuristic to describe this as two systems. And I think that's pushed the field forward quite a bit. And there's sort of properties of one system and properties of another system, and they work in somewhat predictable ways, and that's been a great psychological level of description. But if you start to look at the neural level of description, there's a lot of subtleties and variations that come into play, and the interactions I'm most interested in is the emotion and cognition, because my area of expertise, and there's been this argument that these kind of, you make emotional choices based on your emotion system versus your cognitive system, and they're different choices, and there's two systems that interact, and I think the neuroscience evidence doesn't support that. It suggests a much more subtle and nuanced view. Emotion's not one thing. It's not represented in one way. These systems that underlie emotion and cognition aren't independent in the brain. There are brain structures that are more or less involved in emotional behaviors, but they interact extensively at every level of analysis with those that are considered cognitive behaviors. So it just seems to say that this dichotomy that we've used to understand psychological behavior, and it's been very helpful in driving the field forward, is taken, and now we have it in these two parts of the brain, completely takes away what neuroscience is bringing to the table. Neuroscience, is going to give us a much more subtle and nuanced view of how these things work. And that's going to go back and now refine our psychological models. And it doesn't mean they're not good psychological models or they aren't important psychological models. Right now they're just somewhat incomplete in understanding all of human behavior, which is expected as the field progresses.
Just
one more comment and then...
I mean, just one reason why this side of the room is more relaxed on this topic than the other side. I mean, to be honest, economics, macroeconomics, all the things we explain, how markets work, how GDP grows, is not solidly grounded on how an individual makes decisions. It is not. At the macro level, it has a life of its own. And therefore, economists tend to be willing to say, let's say there's two minds and could be interesting. Sort of the economist joke, let's assume you have a can opener and it'll be all right. Economists are quite relaxed about it because it really doesn't build up, and you change your understanding of how individuals work. Economics doesn't rise and fall on this. Macroeconomics, most of economics, it's not really grounded on those individual behavior.
Thank you. I'm going to take the questions, but you have to walk to the mics, otherwise, and identify yourself. Otherwise, it doesn't record.
Michael Schrager with MIT. First off, very much enjoyed your book, Neuroeconomics.
Thanks.
Superb book. The question is, you have instruments, you look at physics, you look at sciences, and you see this interplay between theory and instrument and experiment. So you've alluded to this. I'd like to know, what is the experiments agenda for neuroeconomics? You talk about subtlety and nuance. What are the 3 or 4 experiments, the Michelson-Morley electron experiment? What are the kind of experiments that you think are going to really make these people sit up and pay attention? Not unlike the way that Danny Kahneman and Tversky, the framing experiments, the Herb Simon stuff, subjective expected utility, affected and influenced quote-unquote rational choice in economics.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go first. Part of the problem is, we all do our own experiments, and so I'm going to tell you my experiments, right? I don't know the ones that are going to make the economists sit up and notice. I feel that's a little bit yet to be determined. Maybe you have a.
I have a more precise answer than that, because she knows I'm much more aggressive with.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the real answer: is the goal is the generalized neural theory of decision. Okay, that is a piecewise explanation of the architecture of the brain and how those elements interact computationally to yield free human choice behavior.
Why do you want to know?
Good question. I don't know. I'm a kid who took stuff apart.
You have to.
Well,
Wait, let me answer the second half of his question before we go any further.
Speak louder.
Yeah, so my answer is I want a generalized neural theory of decision making in the same way that we have a standard model of the atomic structure of the universe, which again, we don't need. I grant you that. But I love that there's a standard model of matter. I don't know.
You're a scientist.
Yeah, I'm a neuroscientist. Now, here's what I think are going to be the qualities of the Michelson-Morley class experiments. They are going to have to start with a problem economists are interested in and have not resolved at the microeconomic level. Alberto knows exactly what I think is the candidate experiment, and it's one to explain this impulsivity. There are going to have to be a series of neuroscientific experiments which yield novel behavioral predictions. This is really critical, because what you're saying when you do that is, I can use the mapping and a study at the neuroscientific level to make a behavioral prediction that has never before been made by an economist, and that an economist would not have thought to make. That behavioral prediction has to be validated, and then the last piece to make this a home run is it has to undermine a major axiomatic theory.
That's important.
And suggest an alteration to that axiomatic theory. As Alberto knows, there are 2 groups in my lab working on experiments that have this flavor. They may or may not succeed. These are the experiments that are really going to, I think, make it impossible to look away.
I completely agree.
Larry Cutler, retired. I would like to know more about economics. You mentioned about this lottery gentleman who wouldn't take the $100, which is irrational. But why don't you think about the forces that are getting him and so many others to go to the lottery? They're not going for $100. They're going for $1 million, whatever they think they might get. I don't know what that has to do with what part of the brain. When you talk about economics, I usually think about totality, and this is all mainly talking about consumerism rather than who are you. In other words, being determines consciousness. I won't go into that too much, but what about the people that are making this lottery thing? Or it was discussed about the automobiles not being developed well enough. There's a lot of mistakes there. What is the purpose? Why does that happen? Certainly there's mistakes in the brain, but there's also such reasons as maybe more of a profit wants to be made, so therefore sometimes they may cut short some of the things that they should do. And also, if you're going to look at prices or costs, if you really want to know the value of things, you're not going to be able to see that. Now, what does that have to do with this? Also, we learn about these things. Some people learn more than others because you're talking about that, because nobody's the same. We're all a little different. We learn about, some learn more than others. And maybe that has something to do with what's in the brain, but the macroeconomics is so much more important about, you know, and let's look at these forces that are making people want that way, or even talk about retirement savings. I mean, what are the motivations? Why does it happen the way it happens? I mean, it's not about something in the brain. There's other reasons for it. Who gets more, who gets less?
Any
I think economists do this. We have not been discussing this too much because economists do this, and we all agree, and Paul agrees that, you know, there are complicated explanations about savings which have nothing to do with the brain, and economists do that well. But there are aspects which are very important. When I reacted to Paul saying I don't think it's true that people undersave, I don't think it's true, but I mean, you know, you see actually a lot of evidence which you can interpret in terms of undersaving, and if that's the case, you know, let's discuss this and let's try and understand it. Now, all the other stuff that you're mentioning, I mean, I completely agree, it's very important. I think we haven't discussed this because it has, as you said, less to do with neuroscience and much more standard economics and
The Secret Life of folks get the title, Secret Life of Homo Economicus. Another Secret Life.
I'm going to take right and left, so it's this side and then you. What you wanted to say?
I was simply going to say, you know, to say, you know, it's not happening in the brain, it's always happening in the brain. Like, everything's happening in the brain, right? Now, you're talking about factors that are not sort of individual factors or cognitive factors, and certainly adding information about culture and social factors is where the study of the human brain is going as well. So I don't think, because you're talking about things that are not just individual choices that have influence from a range of factors, that understanding things at the neural level won't help us understand those decisions as well.
Hello, Henry Kaminer, psychoanalyst, New York City. I would like to change the frame of reference a bit. I think it would be much clearer. See, I think all people make rational choices all the time. Human beings make choices all the time. In fact, all animals make choices all the time. Is something good or bad? Should they go towards it or away from it? They make choices all the time. Now, and it's based upon biological criteria, such as not getting killed, being able to reproduce, being comfortable instead of in pain, on the basic biological level. Now, the microeconomists got all confused because the people they're studying didn't seem to be rational, and it's because their definition of rational is much too narrow. Definition of rational being what is consciously, what the person is consciously aware of and is consciously reporting. If you want to understand the individual, it's much more complex. We psychoanalysts do it better than the economists, because we try to find what they're really afraid of that they don't realize, what they really desperately want but can't admit to themselves. If you factor in all these things, then the choices are rational. For example, there's a very famous economic game, the prisoner's dilemma. You tell someone, the guy in the next booth, whom you don't know, has some money, $100, whatever, he's going to split it with you, and if you agree to the split, you'll get some and he'll get some. So if the guy in the booth says 50-50, you're overjoyed, you say yes. If the guy in the booth says 60-40, you're happy, fine. If the guy in the booth says, I'm going to keep 100, I'm going to keep 99, and you're going to get $1, or let's say, I'm going to keep 90, you're going to get $10, very often the person becomes indignant and says, to hell with it, no one gets any money. And yet that same person, if you would say to that person, imagine the scenario, you found a wallet with $100, you give it back to the person, and he gives you a $10 reward, would you do it? So, oh yes, oh yes. What's the difference? Emotional things about narcissistic injury, fairness, whatever. So if we take these things into account, we can understand the microeconomics. Macroeconomics is easier because we have people of different ages with different requirements and different unconscious needs, and they sort of average out. The irrationals average out, so the macroeconomics people are dealing more with rational people.
So wait, let me ask you one question before we go any further, because I want to understand better. Would you say that people never make irrational decisions, or people predominantly make rational decisions?
I'm reluctant to say never, but certainly predominantly.
I think there's a difference between explainable and rational. I think your example is more that it can be explained, even though it may appear irrational.
I don't agree. I think, so, if we had had Danny here, this would have been a different discussion, because Liz and I would have been beating up on him, and we would have looked much more pro-rational choice. Here's my favorite puzzle like this. I used to get told this. It's a question, as Alberto said, of defining what's in the utility function. That's the whole point. George Lowenstein, a noted economist and psychologist, once gave me this puzzle. You go off to one of your graduate students goes off to a conference at some remote city. She's engaged. And she meets some nice guy, and they go out to a bar. And she's sitting at the bar trying to decide whether or not to go back to the hotel room with this guy. And she does. And then she wakes up the next morning. She's completely distraught and miserable and crying. And so how do you explain that? Because that was an irrational act. And George has argued to us that that's because something emotional takes over control of her behavior, and the rational is part of her. Now, as a biologist, here's my read on that. We evolved to maximize fitness. She is just doing exactly what she was designed by evolution to do. And
how come half of them may do and half of them may not do? Is evolution that...
No, so then I have to explain to you something from game theory called a mixed strategy equilibrium that requires unpredictability in behavior in order to maximize welfare of the agent. So there's a very good answer, but it would take a little while to work through.
But I'll take your word for it, because I don't think you have the answer. I think the only way you can have that answer is if you have the patient in your office, and then you can draw the line that will explain to you why this person did what she did, and another person, very similar in many ways, did not do what she did.
So to me, that is a parallel, even an equivalent perhaps, explanation to the game theoretic one.
No,
okay,
we can't do it forwards, only backwards.
Yes.
If the person comes in and says, I was so tempted, but I didn't.
We can't predict.
We can do it forward in the aggregate.
In the aggregate,
we can't predict.
And in mammalian models and in bird models of monogamous animals, you find this, what you just described.
Sure.
And you find it in human societies too. So that means that there's a biological possibility, a propensity, but it doesn't mean every single person would succumb without many drinks.
This may be helpful. There's a very, very famous puzzle by the economist, physicist, everything elseist, John von Neumann. Sherlock Holmes is in Victoria Station in London, and he jumps on a train which is going to stop at Canterbury on its way to Dover. And he knows that Dr. Moriarty, his arch enemy, has got to the station just after the train is pulled out. So he's okay on the train. Moriarty has a gun, and he will kill Holmes if he can find him. So here's the decision Holmes has to make. If Holmes gets off at Canterbury, I left out one other fact. Moriarty's rich, which you're supposed to know, and he can charter a train. But he has to know where to stop. Because if Holmes gets off at Canterbury and he shoots to Dover, he'll catch Holmes at Dover. But the opposite is also true. So what is Holmes to do? If Holmes says, well, here's what's going to happen. Moriarty is going to think I'm going to Dover. So I'll get off at Canterbury. But of course, Moriarty is smart enough to know that, right? So he'll work through that same logic, and he will also go to Canterbury. By which logic, Holmes should, of course, then triple-cross him and go to Dover, by which you get this idea. Sure. And so the solution, I'm simplifying a tiny bit from the way von Neumann presented it. Von Neumann argues what Holmes is actually supposed to do is flip a coin. That the safest thing he can do is flip a coin. There's a 50% chance he'll get out alive. And a lot of games have this quality, although they don't all require an even coin. It's often true that a weighted coin gives you a better yield. So as an evolutionary biologist, here's my answer. In the aggregate, 30% of the people should do this. This can be predicted by game theory. Now you ask a great question, which is, what is the psychological, and mapping one step down, neurobiological instantiation of that randomization process, or the social instantiation of that randomization process? I am deeply interested in that question. I think we want to be able to answer that at all levels.
My name is Jerry Fuchs, and I'm a business person and a lawyer. I have to say I have a degree in both economics and in finance, and I'm familiar with Dr. Nersessian and the good, not familiar, but the good doctor that preceded me. We're having an interdisciplinary conversation here, a dialogue between different disciplines, and I think it's very laudable that you want to understand economic endeavors scientifically, and I think that's where the neuroscientists are sort of stepping in here, as if they have a greater rationality. The field of economics has been around for an awfully long time, and there are lots of histories and approaches and attempts at understanding human behavior. And human behavior and economic behavior is ever-changing. Group behavior, situations change immediately. Uniform knowledge isn't fair. There's trading algorithms and all sorts of new approaches to the fields of economics. And the field of finance, in the field of finance, if medicine had as much money that was spent on research in the field of finance as was spent in medicine, I mean, the number of people that try to understand the markets and the rationality and the irrationality. And I thought this gentleman's comments were very good in terms of it's not just fear and greed. There's understanding of cars and how cars work and should cars work and what do consumers want. And economics, I think, is no longer sheer economics. It's now political economics, because there is no such thing as really the science of economics. It's so intertwined. But the thing that bothers me here about when we talk about rationality, and the neuroscientists are sort of talking about layering, and they're bringing forth some new scientific understanding that's going to subsume the understanding of the economics in some way, or to create some better understanding. Its contribution, I think we all look forward to it, but for those of us that have been coming to the Philoceti Center, we've heard a lot about neuroscience, and we've heard about some of their promises, and it seems to me that it's rather in an adolescent period with all the, we all hope that neuroscience gives us some greater understanding, but it seems here a little reductionistic and a little overly ambitious. Just two other comments. I mean, to try to understand rationality, we haven't talked about greed or fear. We haven't talked about optimism or pessimism. We haven't talked about conservatism in terms of behavior or flexibility, special, general, masochism, all sort of psychological terms that do enter into this decision. And by the way, there is a course up at Harvard Business School, and a man, Abraham Zalesnik, who's a psychoanalyst who is trying to teach something about behavior theory relative to the understanding psychoanalytic behavior of people and finance. That hasn't even been mentioned here. So I'm just saying, I admire neuroscience, I admire your claim. I think it's a little premature to make these claims and to think that you can really undercut the huge amount of efforts and behavior that are trying to understand what we call rational. And I just leave that point. What is rational? Is rational some neuroscientific term that we can say that's rational because the layer A, B, and C is in function? Or is masochism and psychoanalytic terms in terms of what is rational a much better explanation in terms of what rationality is?
Can I just say one thing? Because I think I must have misspoke terribly.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way hearing that question. As you know,
I really feel
you should both stick
okay.
then.
I must have said something that led you to that conclusion, for which I apologize. The reason I have spent the last 7 years trying to become an economist, and the 7 years before it trying to become a psychologist, is not because I believe neuroscience will subsume economics or psychology. In fact, if you read my papers or my book or any of the things I've written, what I hope you'll see is that all three of those levels coexist in good theories. And my interest is in no way to replace economics. If I was going to do that, I would not certainly have wasted the time to be considered an economist by my colleagues, to try and publish in economics journals. My goal is to understand this process of our behavior in as many different ways as possible, because it is my conviction that understanding it in more ways is more powerful than understanding it less ways. When all is said and done, what you want is an explanation at every level and as many ties between those explanations as you can get. They'll be incomplete. The mappings won't be perfect. That will be the strongest explanation of human behavior. Walling off these disciplines, which is the alternative, strikes me as, ostrich head in the sand. My discipline's fine. Now, neurobiologists mostly believe that. Don't get me wrong. I came from a tradition where they said, when I wrote my first economics paper for neuroscientists, it was, Nature wrote back and said, are you out of your, mind? You want to write a utility function in a neuroscience paper? That is a waste of time. Neuroscientists understand choice completely, and we know exactly how to study it. And ties with economics are a waste of time. So, I feel so passionately about this because I've spent so much time on it. I am not in any sense trying to replace economics or psychology. I am trying to unite them with neuroscience.
I just, I completely agree with everything Paul said. I want to add, I don't think this neuroeconomics is in its adolescence. I think it's in its infancy, and I agree. I felt like when you asked your question that you misunderstood everything I was trying to say today, which is to say that, I'm interested in the psychological level of description. And I think neuroscience can inform that. And I think, when we actually talk among ourselves about what motivates our behavior, we're never going to talk about our neurons. We may, people talk about now, in law as a brain excuse or something like that, but ultimately we care about behavior and people and what the actions people take. So I don't think in any way are we trying to subsume the economic level of behavior. This is adding something to that discussion that could be informative.
I'm sorry, can I just add one little thing to this? From the other side. So I made at some point the example of the glasses, and I said that's rationality. That was supposed to generate the reaction that, we have a very stripped down notion of what rationality is, which has been incredibly powerful on one hand, but of course it's incredibly reductionist. So it seems to me that what they are doing, what neuroeconomics is doing, it's actually going the other way to enrich the notion of rationality that we put into our model, as opposed to what the question seemed to imply, to not be rich enough. The notion of rationality we use is extremely simple and small, and what they're doing, it's just enriching it. So it seems to me the other way around. But
one of the speakers, I'm John Rosenfeld, I'm an analyst in New York. One of the speakers earlier said that people had evolved over hundreds of millions of years to make rational choices. And I think it might be more precise to say that collections of genes have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to make optimum choices, and that those optimum choices for collections of genes might involve irrational choices or variants from rational choices by individuals bearing various portions of those collections of genes. I wonder how the speakers in any way feel they can adapt the rational choice model to speak more broadly to the collections of genes, and in particular, are there any particular cultural, ethological, or other ways of grouping human behavior so that you can see variance in a broad way across those cultures or groups in the way decisions are made?
Anybody wants to tackle that question?
Yes, I really thought about that.
I assume you're thinking of Richard Dawkins' powerful ideas about the selection occurring not just at the level of species, as Darwin had originally proposed in the 1860s, but occurring at the level of individual genes. And of course, we now know that selection occurs not just at the level of individual genes and whole species, but gene clusters. The evolution of data now about the HAP maps and stuff like that seem to indicate that multi-gene loci evolved together. I spoke too quickly when I said that. Selection is definitely occurring at many levels, for sure. As a back-of-the-envelope model, we could take Darwin's and think about selection at the level of the species. It is certainly not the only level at which the selection occurs. And one thing that's striking about this is that some behaviors which appear irrational, when we think about what people tell us verbally they want, I mean, this is natural for an analyst, I assume, make perfect sense when we look more broadly either at the individual's welfare or look at a species, groups of behaviors. Some of them won't explain easily this way. So the idea I want to get across is rationality, in the economic sense, is about maximizing utility function. What goes in the utility function is a little underspecified. And one of the things that we might begin to think about when we think about utility functions is our evolutionary heritage. That's sort of the point I wanted to push. And I want to back away from selection at any one particular level, whether at the meme level, the Deem level, the individual gene level, the hat map level. All of those things are going on, of course.
Are there any experiments which show variation across large populations of these kinds of rational decisions?
There's a great experiment that's unpublished by Reed Montague's group at Baylor College of Medicine. And in this experiment, Reed has his subjects play what looks loosely like a game. For those of you who grew up in psychology departments 20 years ago, what they're actually doing is an experiment of Richard Herrnstein's, of the Harvard psychologist Richard Herrnstein's. They're picking between two levers. The levers pay off money with probability distributions that are a little complicated. It turns out that there are two good solutions to this. One solution is to half the time push the left lever and half the time push the right lever, basically in random order. There is a better solution, but it's hard to find. What you have to do is push the left lever 9 times for every 1 time you push the right lever. The reason this is hard to find is that all the intermediate ratios stink. And it turns out that only half of Reed's subjects find this better solution. Half do and half don't, just odd. So they drew blood from these people, and they genotyped their dopamine receptors. And it turns out that all of the people that find the best solution have a particular isoform of the dopamine D5, if I remember right, subtype of receptor gene. And this particular isoform seems to be associated with propensity towards risky behavior.
Okay. The intellectual power that's represented at the table is overwhelming. I'm overwhelmed by it, and maybe some others. And yet it goes off in so many different directions, it's hard to focus, as you will appreciate. And I also appreciate that it's very difficult to focus on any one thing given what's at the table. It's too much to expect from it. At the same time, I want to make some random comments rather than anything terribly focused. My name is Michael Grupp, and I've spent my time in ethics and moral theory for the last 40 years. And I'm coming out of retirement now to think again, which is why I'm here. I'm remembering a philosophy professor. When you make the comment and you tell us the story of Sherlock Holmes, one of my great heroes, and Moriarty, his arch enemy, and you say that he flipped a coin, you should have flipped a coin in order to make a decision as to what the best thing was to do. There's a professor by the name of K.D. Arani, as I remember him, City College, poor man's Harvard at the time. And Arani stood there like this, and we were discussing free will and determinism. He had his finger out like this. And he said, which one of you can tell whether I'm going to do this or this with that finger? And there was all kinds of debate and discussion for the next 3 or 4 weeks on the topic. And he ended up by saying at one point, which impressed me a lot, it's still with me, and I'm bringing it here to the table. If we knew everything about K.D. Arani, everything, we could predict what he would do. At the time, there was no discussion of neuroscience. I never heard the word before. I knew they were neurons, but I didn't know what they meant. Now you're describing them. This was some time ago. So I begin to wonder what you mean when you say that you, sir, Paul, that's the name I have, want to understand everything there is. When I sat behind you, I couldn't stop the challenge at the moment. To me, it was a challenge. As to why it is that you want to know all these things. What is it that you're interested in to know? And that goes for all of you at the table, and me too, about living in the real world. What is it you really want to know? And why do you want to know that? And then I heard the word control mentioned once or twice. And from the sociological point of view, I left it alone, because I was concerned that we'd be talking about a totalitarian question, which wasn't at the table, and I didn't really want to introduce it, yet I do. Where do you want to go with all this? Maybe this is not the time to answer all that. But here you are in the various university disciplines promoting ideas and organizations, promoting ideas with what in mind? Where is it going to go? Vance Packard, you may remember. Some of you remember that book, The Hidden Persuaders, and I think it's from that book I quote. Subliminal. Do you remember the word subliminal? You still use it? I don't really know. As I say, I'm not sure it's used anymore.
Yes.
But the question was, from the economist's point of view, how could you sell more Coca-Cola? That was the issue. Economics, Economicus, in the movie theater. And so what they did was to put the subliminal phrasing on the bottom of the screen below your consciousness level, but within your framework of reaching you in some level. And during the intermission of this very dull movie, sales of Coca-Cola went up 50, 70, I don't know how much percent. Because you were approached at a way of understanding through your neuroeconomic content, however you want to describe this now, biologically, psychologically, psychoanalytically, Dr. Nersessian, whichever way you wish to go. You were going to change the behavior of people. And what I wanted to know, and what you have to ask, it seems to me, as moral agents, which you are, because you are teaching people what they should be thinking about and making every effort to convince them that your position is a good one. The interplay between you two gentlemen is wonderful. But it masks something, I would suspect. I think it masks the difference between you and making authority in the world, up to a point. And that's all right. We're all there. So I didn't get up to scold. I feel like I'm scolding. I don't mean to scold. And yet it concerns me a great deal about what you mean by control. And that's the deeper issue. You're now about to give another tool to the community that will give somebody an opportunity to have control over what I purchase. And if the box of Tide comes in a blue box, I'll say it's good and mild. And if it comes in a red box, I'll say it's harsh. I don't like the chemistry. And if it comes in a yellow box, I won't buy it anymore because it burns my hand. I could go on indefinitely. I stop at this point.
Thank you.
Mine is just an observation. Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to
Liz? Definitely.
Go ahead.
So I think I think you're bringing up some of the ethical issues that will emerge from this type of research that we do, and this is actually a hotly debated area in the field of neuroscience in general. And there's a Society for Neuroethics, which I'm on the board of, which was formed to try to address some of these questions. So things like what you would call neuroeconomics has been exploited, I guess, by people who are interested in marketing, and there's companies that also are neuromarketing. In the field of law, there's companies that are selling, brain science to look at lie detection and things like that. And all of, I can't speak for everybody. For me, and I'm pretty sure for Paul, our goals are actually as basic scientists to understand how things work, knowing that this will then be applied, hopefully to the treatment of things like psychological disorders, where they're actually helping people. But of course, when you have more knowledge, it can be used now in ways that perhaps society wouldn't be so happy with. And this is not just, this is genetics and physics and all sorts of sciences. And so, so you're saying what our goals are. Again, my goal is basic knowledge. I'm a basic scientist. I don't do my science with a specific application in mind. But I don't think neuroscientists are walking away from these issues and these debates. There has been a large growth in neuroethics and interest in neuroethics over the last 5 years. The Society for Neuroscience has an annual neuroethics lecture. Again, there's a Society for Neuroethics that's formed that is starting to have their own conferences. The American Journal of Bioethics now has a section every month on neuroethics. So these issues are emerging, and how people will use this science is something, again, that we can't necessarily control, which is true of all science. We think it's going to be for good, can't guarantee it will be for good. The best we can do is be part of those debates, talk to the lawyers who are now dealing with court cases where everyone has a brain excuse, for their behavior, and what that really means and doesn't mean.
I'm Michael Sachs. I'm a retired attorney, and I've got a question that's primarily directed to Bill Brown, which has to do really with empirical data and its development, which has to do with what's really going on in our financial services firms, the investment banks, the hedge funds, the private equity funds, in terms of having both their own economists, their own mathematicians, developing their algorithms, studying the actual performance of the markets, and whether or not, to some extent, both the thought that's going on there, the data that they put to use as a matter of applied economics, and presumably the continuing data that they gather over time is sort of an untapped source of information regarding macroeconomic behavior, which might in the end have some microeconomic connection as well.
Well, certainly there's a huge amount of effort that goes on in these financial firms. As was mentioned, there's a lot of resources, and there's returns from doing this work. A lot of it is not, economists probably have a smaller and smaller portion of this work as opposed to other people with other quantitative backgrounds that aren't necessarily economics or either finance, but the definitions, the dividing lines aren't very clear. Anyway, there's certainly a lot going on. Data has been, for a long time, going back 20 or 25 years, financial firms recognize the value of data sets. Having information on pricing, having information on a whole range of things, defaults, is useful things that you could make money on, and that if you have it, you have an advantage over the other people. So effort has been put into collecting data on different aspects of things. The question of whether it's useful to, at a truly macro level, I would be hard pressed to find good examples of that. I certainly know where it's been tried. When scanning things came in stores, the question is, okay, you're at Walmart, you get all this scanning data. This is hugely good stuff. Economists can do things, we can explain a lot, the macro. I wouldn't say that's an area that's produced a whole lot. It's probably produced less than people thought. There's a whole set. I think most of the work is pretty just straightforward. You can make money by predicting how many home loans will be repaid in each zip code in the United States. That's not a very interesting question but from a money point of view, that's our biggest financial market is mortgages, and prepayment rates make a huge difference to their value, and there is a lot of guys out there trying to predict prepayment rates for each mortgage. So there's a lot of that.
Notoriously irrational market as it is.
And it's very
ill-predicted.
Very difficult.
But in developing that kind of data, are they looking back in time to look at prior experience and therefore private behavior within the various zip codes? So in the core, isn't there really some information regarding the behavior of individuals?
Yes.
In the mass?
Yeah.
Right.
Sure, certainly. And I'm sure access to that data is of interest to academics and people with other interests than the firm, and I'm sure that happens at some level.
Thanks.
Yeah, information management, I certainly agree with it. Oh, my name is Eric Hooks, and I've been many things in my time, as they say in The Man Who Would Be King, most of which are best left unsaid. So having been a foot soldier in the military and a trader, I was a currency trader, I was self-employed for a while, and I'm very keenly aware of the significance of information and access to it. And I did take a medical ethics course a long time ago, and I certainly appreciate, how significant the issues you raised always are, and also, as you yourself suggested, Paul, just information, the pursuit of information, and if you have it in its entirety, and hopefully you're able to show some sunlight on all aspects of it, I think that addresses some of the ethics questions, hopefully there. But I was curious because I took decades ago when E.O. Wilson's book first came out, before sociobiology was a dirty word, and they had to change it, to evolutionary psychology.
We still use it.
Okay, well, you're in the ivory tower, so I guess you can get away with it. But
as you know, Wilson got a picture of ice cold water dumped on his
head. I think it was right after that time they started changing the word. I saw him about a month ago, in coinciding with the release of his collected works and stuff. But since you have essentially made such a pretty package here in actually talking, without naming the word consilience, again, and I'm not sure how many people are really prepared for that.
I'll tell you, my book, the last paragraph ends with the word consilience.
It does. It does. I mean,
available for purchase.
Okay, I have. I thought it was fascinating because his book, when it first came out, had devoted some 500 plus pages to what you observe about behavior in nature, and clearly nobody goes to school for that, nor are they given maybe parental pushing verbally in a direction for choice making. But in the last 30 pages, of course, are incredibly controversial. But since this is an area that you're living, perhaps you could do your bit publicly here for some of the notions that he was addressing and is your final word in your book.
He's my hero, flat out. As a biologist, as a sociobiologist, I think Wilson is just one of the greatest thinkers of the last 100 years. Like one of the 5 or 6 most important thinkers of the last 100 years. In Consilience, what he argues is exactly what I believe, that there is a tremendous amount of unity between fields of knowledge, and that what has happened in the last couple of 100 years is we have revealed, starting at the really easy stuff like quantum physics, we've revealed the unities that connect knowledge at different levels. And it's his conviction that we'll be able to draw parallels and mappings as we move up even to the level of whole social systems of behavior. And what he argues in the book, very, I think, eloquently, but I guess not everyone drew that conclusion, was that the really big challenge is the gap between the social sciences and the natural sciences. And bridging that gap is going to be really, really hard. At my university, there is a dean for social sciences and a dean for natural sciences, and those are 2 separate divisions of school. We're working on that problem. Is basically the issue.
Everything's subsumed under biology.
No, see, I don't think that happens. I know you're daring me. I really. No, look.
Not going to happen.
Look, the reason you know that won't happen is because there is still a department of chemistry. 110 years ago, a bunch of chemists and physicists had this battle about whether physics was going to become chemistry. Quantum theory emerged. It unites physics and chemistry, for sure. Both of those disciplines rely on it. Guess what? You still have to pick whether you want to be a professor of chemistry or physics. So do I hope 100 years from now, there'll be mappings between psychological levels, economic levels, neuroscientific levels? I'm convinced there will be. But I think you'll still have to pick what you want to be a professor of.
Thank you for the vote.
Henry.
I want to react to a couple of Henry Earl, New York. A couple of things that Dr. Nersessian touched on. One was the talk 15 years ago in New Orleans about neuroscience and its applications in unsolved problems in psychoanalysis, and what use is knowing about vasopressin. I remember in 1950 sitting and listening to endless lectures by the discoverer of vasopressin and oxytocin, Vincent de Vigneault, and thinking to myself, what use is this going to be? This is impossible. I don't understand how he arrived at this, how he found it, and what use is it going to be. And then from there I'd go to the anatomy lesson, and I didn't really understand quite what the uses were of knowing all the 200 bones. The only use of anatomy at that point in my career was to go home and try it at home. But beyond that, it really wasn't much use, and nobody would particularly countenance you using anatomy in your first year of medical school in any useful way. But if you move forward, in tomorrow's New York Times Magazine section, there's an outline of a woman with very high uncontrolled hypertension. You could read one paragraph of that, and if you knew enough anatomy, you could know why this woman had uncontrolled hypertension. So it took about 57 years for some of that to pay off, and what I'm trying to get at is, I think these metaphors and similes and fantasies are immensely powerful. But it takes an awfully long time to develop the information, to test the information, to validate the information, to show that it has predictive value. Now, this week there was a discovery announced that may someday, 100 years from now, rank with some of Newton's observations. Ventnor, who in many ways has a very mixed background in the genetics community, took his own yacht and went around, and every 200 miles took water out of the ocean and used molecular biology techniques to not culture bacteria from that, because that doesn't work very well, but to use much more advanced methods to look at the genetics of the millions of bacteria that are in all water, and to outline a whole new structure that's going to have to be validated, that's going to have to be repeated. I think the urge to have some answers right now, because we need the answers right now, the pain is right now, the hypertension is right now, but to develop this and to test it and to show that it has predictive value, that takes a very long time.
Thanks.
Well, Liz and I are still young, so.
If there are no other questions, we will stop. Thank you very much.